thank you all very, very much. And the truth is that Lisa Nelson was the executive director at GOPAC during the period when we were educating 75,000 people around the country with audio tapes in a monthly program, which led up to the contract with America and the first Republican majority in 40 years. So she was a key part of the team that made it possible for us to build that 4-decade-long drought and replace it with what became a very competitive Republican position in the U.S. House ever since. So it was a fundamental change in the underlying power structure of the city. And from that, we got welfare reform, Medicare reform, the largest capital gains tax cut in history, and 4 consecutive balanced budgets for the only time in your lifetime. So Lisa had a significant role in helping change history. And now she's back doing the same thing in 50 states. So it's exciting. I really want to talk about, and I thought, by the way, that Lieutenant Governor Sears was remarkable and did just an amazing job, and her message was very powerful. So I want to thank her. And she sort of set up what I want to talk about, because I think people want hope. I was very impressed during the campaign that she and Glenn Youngkin and the Attorney General ran as a team. First of all, when you have an African-American lieutenant governor and the son of Cuban refugees as your Attorney General candidate, it made it very hard for the Washington Post to explain that this was basically a white supremacist ticket. They tried. She suffers a little bit from the Clarence Thomas problem that, Clarence would have been an African-American member of the Supreme Court, except that he's conservative, and therefore he can't have been an African-American member of the Supreme Court, but they don't quite know what to do with him, because when you meet him, he clearly is an African-American member of the Supreme Court. And therefore, the #1 rule in the media for years was don't do anything. Pretend he's not there. To which Clarence relaxed and became ultimately the longest serving member in the current court. So, and a person of growing influence. I think that Lieutenant Governor Sears has a great future, and I have a hunch that you're going to see her around for many years, and you're going to see her in jobs that are more and more important. Although, to be truthful, being Lieutenant Governor of Virginia is not a bad point for somebody coming out of the Marine Corps to be able to say, I kept working, I didn't retire totally. She's done great. And her daughter's here, and I know that her daughter must be very proud to be able to travel with her mom. I think the other, in addition to the Virginia results, which were very interesting, the other race, which I think was there are 2 other races that were very, very important. One involving a Democrat. When New York City finally gets desperate enough to elect a 20-year veteran captain of the New York City police force as the mayor, you know that maybe de Blasio has done something remarkable. He has governed so badly that he has driven the city back to conservatism in a way that I think will be very historic and fascinating to watch. New York, as late as 2017, was the safest it had been in its history. From the time Giuliani took over through Bloomberg and the first couple years of de Blasio, the murder rate went down every year. It was an astonishing achievement. And they know why it went down. I did brief commercial, I do at Gingrich 360. I do 3 newsletters that are free every week and 3 podcasts. And I've done 2 podcasts with the former police commissioner in New York, who's a remarkable figure in his own right. And he made the point that we actually know how to bring crime under control. It requires you have a prosecutor who will prosecute, and it requires that you try to actually get ahead of the crime. Their key was not how do we catch the criminal afterwards. Their key was how do we identify the places where crime is likely to happen and have police there before there's a crime, thereby discouraging people from trying to be criminals. And it came out of an article called Broken Windows that had been written in the 70s, and basically argued that if you have lots of broken windows and lots of trash and a neighborhood looks bad, you actually increase the rate of crime. But if you replace the broken windows, you clean up the trash, you take the graffiti out, crime goes down dramatically because you've now created an environment in which being criminal is a much bigger hurdle. It's not a big hurdle if the place is already trashed. It's a big hurdle if the place is nice. That may sound simple, but they applied it relentlessly. Chief Bratton, they brought down the murder rate in the first 2 years by 14%, and they just kept improving things. And I think you're going to see New York suddenly move from de Blasio's insanity back to a rational, solid, common sense, basically conservative position. And I think that's an amazing achievement. The other achievement, which I want to mention to all of you, because it's where I think it could happen in every single state in the country, is the race of Ed Durr Jr. in New Jersey. Durr was an independent truck driver. He applied for a concealed carry permit. He was turned down by the state of New Jersey. It made him very angry. And so he decided to run against the state Senate president, who got 58% 4 years ago and won a race in which $17 million was spent, the most expensive legislative race in the country, because the teachers union tried to beat him. So if you went to a normal consultant and you said, what do you think are the odds of a totally unknown guy beating a man who got 58%, is the second most powerful politician in New Jersey, and won a race with 17 million last time. And by the way, the guy we're talking about will spend $2,300, most of it at Dunkin' Donuts for coffee and donuts for his volunteers. Now, what are the mathematical odds he's going to win? And he did. He did for a very simple reason. People looked at the ballot and said, not him. They weren't sure who Durr was, but they knew Durr wasn't the state Senate president. Well, I want to suggest to you that next year, in almost every state in the country, can become a not-them election, even here in California. Because, I met somebody from Hawaii, even in Hawaii. Because if gasoline keeps going up, if it actually does cost over the 50% more to heat this winter, if the price of food keeps going up, and by the way, when gasoline and oil go up in price, it raises the price of fertilizer. When the price of fertilizer goes up, it raises the price of food. So you have a whole series of waves coming, which will lead people to say, and I think this is the most important single phrase for 2022, this ain't working. I mean, you walk up to them, and whether you're talking about illegal immigration, current policies on COVID, schools that don't teach or they teach the wrong things, murder rates that are going up faster than any time in American history, gasoline prices, you just name it. And you say to people, hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless in Los Angeles and San Francisco, is that working? And so you're going to end up with a group of people who have to claim that it's working, and a group of people who say, this is not Republican or Democrat. I think you could actually see in a number of states a coalition of everybody who agrees it isn't working, of every ethnic background. Now, here's the challenge for ALEC and the challenge for you. It's the reason I wrote Beyond Biden. I was tempted, being a good, solid, right-wing Republican, I was tempted to write a book attacking Biden and Harris. And I thought, Biden and Harris are going to do enough to discredit themselves. That you don't really need an anti-Biden and Harris book. I mean, they'll provide you. I'll just give you an example. I was on Fox the other morning and I said, I personally worry less about Biden falling asleep than I worry about Harris laughing. And I'd rather have Biden falling asleep By the way, there's a website you can go to that has 10 hours of Harris laughing. Some person who was deranged and apparently had nothing to do sat down and went through all of her interviews and put together all of her laughs. And I've told people, your child misbehaves, first time, 10 minutes of laughter. Second time, you lock them in a room for 30 minutes of laughter. After that, they come out, they're good for weeks. So I thought, what does the country need? It doesn't need an anti-Biden book. It needs, and this is a national crisis in my judgment that we don't know how to deal with yet, and our news media is totally incapable of dealing with. We're at the edge of several huge crises. One involves China, and China is a genuine, effective competitor on a scale that we've never seen, much bigger than the Soviet Union, or much bigger than Nazi Germany. And we're not prepared at the present time to deal with them. And frankly, if you said to me, what is the number one thing you have to deal with? It's education. You keep having schools, for example, in Baltimore, there are at least 5 schools where not a single student could pass a state exam. Not one. Now, how are you going to produce students in that kind of environment who are going to compete with the Chinese? This is a real crisis for us. It's terrible for the children. It cripples their future. Terrible for the neighborhood. And it's terrible for national security. So we have to have a conversation. But the question then becomes, what do we do about it? This is compounded because all of our bureaucracies are industrial era dinosaurs. I'll give an example. I'm a conservative, so you automatically assume I'm pro-defense. I'm the longest serving teacher for brigadier and major generals in the military, going back to the mid-1980s. The Pentagon was opened in 1943 to house 31,000 people using manual typewriters with carbon paper. They managed the entire global war. Well, what's the relative exchange rate between a manual typewriter with carbon paper and an iPad, or a smartphone, or a laptop? 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1? So why do we still have 31,000 people pretending that they still have manual typewriters with carbon paper? And I would argue, as public policy, we would be better off if we reduced the Pentagon to a triangle, turned the other 2/3 of it into a military museum. And I mean this quite literally. I've had several general officers come up to me and say, "You didn't really mean that, did you?" I said, "Yes. We spend more than the next 38 countries combined for defense. And we have managed to mess ourselves up so much with so much red tape, so much regulation. A lot of this is Congress's fault. Every time we make a mistake, they add a new regulation, which, by the way, doesn't stop the next mistake. It just means you go through a lot more paperwork before you screw up. The result is we can't use technology at the rate of China and Russia. We can invent it, we just can't use it. Now this will be, if this is not fixed, it will be catastrophic. And think about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and not the decision to withdraw, but the implementation of withdrawal. Remember, the people who couldn't figure out that you couldn't give up Bagram Air Base before you got out are the ones we're counting on to fight China. Doesn't make me feel very warm and fuzzy, because I don't think they're competent. I think they are used to being defeated. I think they're used to lying to us. And if you think that's too strong a word, get a book called The Afghanistan Papers, which has 20 years of internal conversations at the Pentagon in which they clearly admit at very senior levels they cannot tell us the truth. I mean, when I describe a real crisis, I mean a real crisis. And here's the challenge for all of you as legislators. What are the fixes? If the schools aren't working, in addition to school choice, what else do we do? And what do you do in big cities? If it's not appropriate to have 300, 400, 500,000 people who are homeless, which is largely a mental health and drug addiction problem, what are the new policies? If you don't think we ought to have human feces in large quantity on San Francisco streets, what's our policy alternative? If you want our manufacturing, if we want to bring all computer chip manufacturing home, which we probably should, then what kind of changes in regulation and taxes does that take? Look at healthcare. I mean, the failure to deal with COVID in a calm, rational way is a comment on the collapse of our public health system. I used to represent the Center for Disease Control. In fact, I used to help them get a fairly large amount of money. They were once a great institution. They are now a tired, incompetent bureaucracy. And you go and look at their role in the first 3 or 4 months of COVID, it's an embarrassment. They couldn't invent a test, and because they're a good bureaucracy protecting their own plot, they didn't want anybody else to invent the test. So lots of people out here were inventing tests. They were just being stopped by the federal government. And you can go through the whole thing that way. We have followed a policy of vaccination only and no therapeutics. And then, of course, you get new variants. And we're going to vaccinate every 6 months? That's insane. We should have at least as much emphasis on therapeutics as we have on vaccinations. But that violates the ethos of the public health people. Children who are wearing masks don't socially mature fast enough. Well, there's no question about this now. But nobody in the room thought about that. Closing down your entire economy is really destructive. Killing a couple 100,000 small businesses is a lifetime disaster. Nobody in the room thought about that. And these should be bigger scandals, and every state should be tearing apart what doesn't work, but then you've got to invent what's going to work. And we're working with a small firm called Sync out in Nebraska, which specializes in bringing together health information in real time, not as a reporting device, but as a management device. So you can actually track what's happening, who it's happening to, et cetera. I, at one point, had talked with a firm in Canada which tracked worldwide COVID in real time. It was taking over 2 weeks for CDC to do it because they're still using fax machines. And I couldn't break through. I mean, even with the relationship I had with Pence and Trump, I couldn't break through. Because the bureaucracy said we didn't invent it, it threatens us. My God, what if we were actually efficient? Half of us would be gone. And so, by the way, this is my last comment because I want to take questions, and I'll stay around after we get done later on in terms of signing books and getting pictures for those of you who are really foolish enough to want to do all that stuff. But I just want to close with this thought. There come times when you have to have a cycle of absolute revival and modernization. We've done it 5 or 6 times in our history as a country. We're actually quite good at it, and we drive our opponents crazy because we leapfrog past them. The Soviets once built an extraordinarily good air defense system, a huge investment. And 2 years later, we unveiled stealth aircraft that they couldn't see at all. We block obsolescence their entire investment with one press conference. So we can do this. We can learn. The Japanese hit us at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, and by the following May, we were capable of beating them in Midway, to their enormous shock. But it takes in every state 3 things. Find what doesn't work, figure out a modernization that will improve and work, and then remember that as much as you and the state government don't like the feds interfering with you, you have counties, cities, towns, sheriff offices. You need to decentralize back to them as much as you want Washington to decentralize back to you. And then you have hundreds of thousands of Americans inventing a better future. And my last comment is, go around to your State Department of Education and go around to your county education offices and ask, is this person really more valuable than a teacher? If the answer isn't yes, why are you paying them? You could take, now this will cause a revolution, people will be very angry at you. And this is why people don't have the guts normally to do it. But think about it. You have more than enough money to have dramatic increases in teaching salaries and at the same time to have accountability for teachers. If in fact we didn't have this huge mound, I think only 1/3 of all education spending gets to teachers. The rest is spent somewhere above. It's just thoughts. So if it's okay with Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and take questions. And I'm told that there'll be people with microphones, which will make it even more exciting. So, okay, the microphone people are actually in charge. Pick somebody and give them a microphone.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
I got a question for you. Just watching going on in Washington nowadays, both parties, it seems like the presidency's kind of become more of a imperial presidency, thousands of executive orders coming in all the time. Do you think that Congress would one day stand up and say, hey, we got to rein in a successive presidency, stop some kind of imperial? I mean, most of the power should be in the building with a dome on it and not at the White House.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just wrote some material pointing out that the legislature is actually the center of freedom because presidents are essentially elected kings. And I think that requires a balance of power, starting with the budget and the appropriations bills, because nothing gets the executive's attention like cutting off the money. You can give all the speeches you want to, but if the check doesn't show up, then they have real responsibility. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think it will happen. I mean, again, we've had a long period of, 225 years of back and forth balances. And I think in national security inevitably centralizes power because you have to have a commander-in-chief. But there's a lot of domestic stuff, frankly, that we ought to just send back home. And not only shouldn't go to the White House, it shouldn't go to the Congress. It should be dealt with at a state-by-state level or below.
Mr. Speaker, thinking back to the contract on America, we had a national imperative, and we also had some pretty good leadership at that time. Thinking back to what you were facing during those times, what is it going to take for us as a party to have that level of cohesion and that imperative to be able to recreate that kind of momentum that we saw back then in our party?
Well, I actually, for the first time since 1994, think it would be a good idea in both 22 and 24 to have a contract. And I think that it will actually be harder. I helped the Reagan team in '80, and we came up with 5 items, and we actually had our first Capitol Steps event in 1980, and had we had Governor Reagan and Bush and the House and Senate candidates. And that unity, I think in early October, actually helped us pick up 5 Senate seats with a combined margin of 75,000 votes. And nobody expected election morning that Howard Baker would be the majority leader. And the next day he was, because we won the Senate. We picked up 33 House seats. And Reagan won the largest electoral college victory over an incumbent in history. And then in '94, I think the contract was extraordinarily helpful. It will be harder this time for a funny reason. In '94, we'd been out of power for 40 years. Nobody thought it was real. So they say, well, if that's what Newt wants to do, what the heck, he's at least trying, why turn him down? And one of the examples, and we deliberately had everybody sign the contract, I think with 2 exceptions. Everybody else signed the contract. Well, when we won, I had a chairman, brand new chairman of the committee, hadn't had a Republican chairman in 40 years. And he walked in and he said, you know, the 3 really big items coming through my committee, I'm actually opposed to. And I said, we have a challenge. First of all, you signed the contract. And second, all the rest of us signed the contract. Now, if you really can't, in good conscience, report these 3 items, the new chairman will. But notice the difference between the Gingrich model and the Pelosi model. We had all collectively agreed on it. We had all collectively campaigned on it. We'd all collectively signed it. It wasn't me showing up early in the morning saying you have to vote for it to read it. Because I actually thought every member mattered. However, as a member, you actually had to pay attention. Well, the tragedy now will be trying to do a new contract. They'll all know it's real. And therefore, it'll be much more, it's going to take a lot of negotiating and be very challenging. But I think we should have one, and I think it would galvanize the country. And personally, I believe it should include a balanced budget requirement, because I think it really does change Washington. Yes, sir.
Thank you, and I'm from Alaska, so it's wonderful to see you again. My question is Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution and your feelings on the Convention of States.
My biggest feeling is that I have no reason to believe, for example, that California would not send a delegation chosen by the teachers union and the service employees union. So I'm not quite sure why conservatives think that a convention of states would somehow magically be different than the current power structure. I think you have to change the power structure before you can even think about convening anything else. And we found this out in '95. If you do change the power structure, people then don't need a convention of states, because the truth is, at that point, you get everything done you want to without having to do that. But that's, to me, the challenge has always been that if you tried to organize that, the left is better structured, better organized, and has more money. And there's no reason to believe that they wouldn't try to dominate that very process. Yes, sir.
My question relates to the polarization that exists, the toxic polarization between the left and the right, and the inability for anybody to get together. Trump rides the horse north at a clip, and 4 years later, Biden rides the horse south at a clip. We know that Reagan and Tip O'Neill were truly friends. And if you want to see some great humor, watch Reagan roasting Tip O'Neill in charity fundraisers. You and Bill Clinton actually accomplished things, even though you were from different parties. How are we ever going to achieve anything, especially on the international stage, when we have Putin and Xi who have solid direction and we keep waffling? Is there a future? Is there hope? And what will it take?
Well, first of all, I'm an optimist in part because I think 330 million free people have a level of energy and reserve and capability that dwarfs the Kremlin or dwarfs the houses out around the lake in Beijing. I think, and we've been through this before, Khrushchev was going to bury us. The Nazis thought we were weak and incapable of doing anything. The Japanese thought they could surprise us and that we'd be in a state of shock and want to negotiate. The British thought that we were a tiny set of colonists on a distant continent facing the most powerful army and navy in the world. At that level, I worry a lot about losing a short, sharp fight between an incompetent American national security system, both intelligence and Pentagon, and the Chinese. I worry a lot about a real use of weapons of mass destruction, whether electromagnetic pulse or cyber war or nuclear war. I mean, those things scare me. And I mean, genuinely, part of why I'm still so active. But I don't worry in any serious long competition. We go through cycles like this as the virtue of studying history. We're in a period where we're screwed up. As many things as Bill Clinton got in trouble over, the fact is he and I were both like graduate students. You know, we could hang out together. When we negotiated the balanced budget, we had 35 days sitting in the cabinet room arguing. 35 days. Occasionally I'd go up and have a drink with him in the evening. There's a certain mythology, by the way, about Reagan and O'Neill. I mean, O'Neill also said Reagan has ice water in his veins. Reagan and O'Neill was a very tough partisan. And Reagan was a very tough partisan, but he looked like a movie actor, and he smiled a lot. And so people thought, isn't he really nice? Which, of course, drove the Democrats crazy, because he could get away with stuff, and they'd be frothing at the mouth, and everybody would be going, he's such a nice person. But Reagan was a very, very good partisan. And by the way, Reagan almost never negotiated. That's why he had Jim Baker. Because Reagan, who had been a good negotiator, he was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, led the only strike they ever had, which was over whether or not actors should get royalties from things like television. And he won the strike. So he knew how to negotiate. George Shultz, the Secretary of State, said to me one time that when they first got to meeting with Gorbachev, that all the Reagan senior team was terrified, because they sort of thought of him as like Biden. You know, he's older, he's probably not very competent, you know, he's going to forget things. And Schultz's version of this, which is a little self-serving for Schultz, is, I said to him, he's already led a strike, he knows how to negotiate, he's read every single document we've been able to produce on Gorbachev, and he knows what he believes in. He said he's going to take him to the cleaners. And Callista and I did a movie on Reagan called Rendezvous with Destiny. And there's this great scene, you may remember. They're meeting in the middle of the winter in Switzerland. It's cold. Reagan arrives first, goes inside, takes off his coat, stands next to the fire getting warm. The Soviet limousine pulls up. Reagan comes out, almost like a scene from the movie, which is how he thought, trots down the stairs in his suit, no coat, to greet Gorbachev and help him out of the car in a huge, heavy Russian coat and big Russian hat. So it looks like this old, tired Russian is being helped by this young, energetic American. Do you think Reagan hadn't thought that through and staged it? They go in to meet. Reagan says, he started every meeting with jokes with Gorbachev. He loved collecting anti-Soviet jokes. He said, man's asked by the press, how much freedom do you have? The man says, I'm as free in Russia as I am in America. The reporter says, what do you mean? He says, well, I can stand up in Jackson Square in front of the White House, and I can say Ronald Reagan is a terrible person. And I can stand up at the Kremlin Square in front of the Kremlin, and I can say Ronald Reagan is a terrible person. The purpose of the joke was to say to Gorbachev, I know who you are. I know it's a dictatorship. So let's start from a standpoint of honesty. And supposedly, he then said, you're not going to be able to compete with us. We have the free world has 90% of the scientists and engineers, and I would push the button. So you can't win a nuclear fight. And what we're really talking about now is how we work out the process of what ultimately happened, which was the end of the Soviet Union. Now, that's totally different than people think. You will get bipartisanship when you get a huge majority. We had 90-something% support for welfare reform. Reagan had huge support for 3 tax cuts. You have to pick the fights where you have massive majorities. For example, last example, if you ask people, do you agree with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. that it is the content of your character, not the color of your skin, that really matters. It's a 91-6 issue, which is part of why when the former governor of Virginia said on the Sunday before the election, we have too many white teachers, it was not only a blatantly racist statement, but it was a stupid statement. If he'd said we have too many mediocre teachers, which of course the teachers union would have attacked him for, if he said we need to have, every child deserves an excellent teacher, is one comment. Every child deserves a teacher who looks like them. By the way, in a state which has, I think, 2,300 Polynesians, just to give you an example. I mean, the diversity in Virginia is amazing, just as it is in California. So you start saying students ought to have teachers who are like them. If you actually meant that and you actually tried to do it, you would have a really complicated hiring problem. So I am confident, I believe in America, I believe that we have a great future, and I'm particularly delighted. My dad served 27 years in the Army. So the Wounded Warriors Project, I think, is very, very important. And I think that it's very important during the holidays that we remember our veterans and we remember the veterans' families. And so it is an honor for me to be able to invite Winsome Sears, a veteran herself, to come back up here, and she's going to chat with you right after we have a film. Thank you all very, very much.